The Gauteng Education Department has closed Crowthorne Christian Academy for operating illegally. The Midrand-based school came under the spotlight over its hair policy after a black girl pupil was kicked out on Wednesday for having dreadlocks. The department says it had initially hoped to help the school, including taking the management through compliance processes. It also says pupils will be moved to other schools and urged parents to call if they require assistance. Joining me now to speak about the code of conduct in schools and education is education specialist, Professor Mary Metcalfe. Good to have you on the program this afternoon, Prof. Now, the recent incident at Crowthorne Christian Academic School, which involves students' dreadlocks, has really caused outrage and resulted in legal charges being pressed. Now, the school's code of conduct emphasizes natural hair. How do you interpret the term natural hair in the context of school policies and the potential cultural implications here?
That's an interesting question, Nhlanhla, because let's first of all take the question of natural hair, then I'm going to go to the issue of code of conduct and cultural practices. So let me perhaps do all three. So the issue of natural hair, this is such an emotional issue for people who are black, because the issue of white prejudice towards black hair and attempts to control it are an issue of outrage and offense and hurt for many black men and women across many countries. So to keep saying to young black women and men, you can't wear your hair because it's not like ours, is just so deeply offensive. This should never have happened, because if we look firstly at the need for all schools to be much more open to understanding their deep prejudices, prior held assumptions, call it racism, but it has to be a conscious decision of all schools which are interacting with groups with whom they may not have interacted adequately before and may hold unarticulated prejudices. It has to be a conscious decision to say, let me learn more about myself and how I may have acquired attitudes and prejudices that I've never examined. That's the first thing. If we look at a code of conduct, I think that we as South Africans need to understand why we use the word code of conduct, not simply rules. Because a code of conduct has implied within it the notion of values. And it has the notion of accepting responsibility for one's own conduct in relation to others in a social space. School rules imply these are the rules and you have to follow them and there's consequences. All of that may be true, but more properly it is embedded in an educational practice of understanding one's conduct in relation to others. Now, that terrible incident at Crowthorne, firstly, just shows the extent of prejudice against black hair, but it also just shows a way of interacting in one's own conduct that is simply unacceptable. And how once you have such aggression and it's inflamed, it accelerates and it's volatile.
Yeah.
I was on a panel with Basil Manuel from NAPTOSA this week, and he said something that I just loved, and it's consistent with my view of this code of conduct, is that he said, in education, we as educationists have to take the lead in making sure that our behavior, our code of conduct, the way that we practice is as envisaged by the Constitution. And it's when we fail that then the state has to step in and remind us of what's implied in the Constitution. And that therefore goes to the question of cultural practices. We have a country where we celebrate the diversity of faith and culture. And there's no school that can say, their separate identity overrides the Constitution. So that's a long answer, Nhlanhla.
Let's crystallize that long answer. I mean, this incident has also led to picketing by notably the EFF, who criticized the school's policy as being racist. What do you think schools can really do to address concerns which have been raised by the students, the parents, and the wider community, while also maintaining discipline at schools such as this?
My view is that when any school, an institution, or a person is accused of racism, their first response should never be, "I'm not." It should be, "This is an opportunity for me to learn." Is a perception that something I've said or done or haven't said or haven't done is hurtful to somebody else in the community. Let me use this as an opportunity to understand why, because by doing so, I may learn something that I didn't know before. So yes, if there's a criticism of racism, it's not to become defensive. It's not a deep moral failing, because it often is a consequence of privilege and a consequence of not having been thoughtful. Use it as an opportunity to think and to reflect on one's own privilege.
Now, there have been developments with the school being forced to close for running illegally, but the Gauteng Department of Education has also offered alternative schooling and counseling to the affected student. Now, how important is it for educational authorities to also provide support and solutions in such situations?
I would say that whole community probably needs a process to think through what happened, think through individual conduct and consequences of others. And the event itself would have been traumatic, as well as the subsequent exposure and being on a kind of national stage. And everybody needs time to think that through. As I understand it, the Gauteng Department of Education has closed the school because it isn't compliant with its registration when it originally registered. So I'm not quite sure where the children are now and where they are being dispersed to. And I know that it's in an area where there's a high demand for school places. So I'm assuming the GDE is helping those learners, particularly ones of compulsory school-going age, but all of them, to access our alternative school. I think families across the spectrum of diversity that we have in a school have a responsibility to say, this has been an incident that's affected my child. Let's reflect this together. Let's talk to people who can help us understand different perspectives.
Now, the school's principal allegedly also informed the student's parents that her hair extensions also violated the code of conduct. But how can schools ensure clear communication with parents and students regarding these policies that they have to prevent any kind of misunderstanding?
Well, you may have noticed that I sort of giggled when you said hair extensions are not allowed. I don't understand it. You know, I don't have black hair. I try to understand the complexity of how black hair is different to my kind of curly hair.
Right.
I can't understand why an extension is a problem. So I would say, if there is a rational reason for a hair extension being a problem, this needs to be understood, because it's a code of conduct, not just a rule that's arbitrary, which isn't. I'm not saying all rules are arbitrary, but if they're not mediated through an educative process of understanding why, they appear arbitrary.
Yeah.
So if I decided to have extensions and I was at school still and somebody said you can't, I would very much hope that somebody would explain to me why I can't have extensions, because I don't get it. Do you? I mean, why?
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure you'd agree with
If
me
rules
that...
sorry, I'm interrupting you. But if rules don't have an educative content, if rules do not appear rational, if rules are not helping us understand how we should relate to each other, then they're not educational. Sorry, back to you.
And in the same breath, I mean, that exact same breath, the incident has again brought up these broader questions about the role of dress codes and conduct policies in shaping students' identities. But how can schools find this balance between instilling discipline and allowing students to express their cultural or individual identities here?
I love that, because that's the educational project. That's the educational project. Schools should be there to help learners understand how the expression of a cultural belief, a religious belief, deeply held, means that I also have a responsibility to understand other people's religious beliefs and cultural beliefs deeply held. This is, for a good educationist, this is a splendid opportunity to think through those issues and develop and contribute to the deepening of values that are much bigger than rules. And that's probably the main point I'm trying to make in terms of rules. It should be value-based, it should be deeply understood, and not just compliance with a rule because somebody in authority says it must be the case. Once you have that understanding, that could be summarized into a set of rules, but it should be based in my responsibility and your responsibility.
Now, social media has also played a critical role in spreading information about this incident and the school's policy. How do you think digital platforms influence this public perception of school policies and also the enforcement here?
Well, I think that we have several incidents in our recent history where the fact that somebody had a phone and videoed what was happening has meant that incidents that would otherwise have been hidden and only spoken about in a contested way have been put on the public platform. And I think that that is a very valuable thing in an open democracy. I mean, the other incident, of course, is the issue of the presidential bodyguards.
Yeah.
If that had been videoed, I don't think it would have had the same impact.
Now, this incident, as we wrap up, also highlights this intersection of education and societal issues like race and cultural diversity, as we've discussed. How can educators and policymakers as well indeed work together to create policies that address these complexities?
That is why I think the legislative requirement that each school develop a code of conduct is so valuable, because we have very few schools which are attended by a completely homogeneous group of people. And even if they are attended by a homogeneous group of learners, it behoves the school to make sure that their learners have opportunity to learn about broader diversity. What better way of doing this than with a code of conduct? What better way of doing this than by looking at the practices within the school assembly? We cannot assume that a public school, which is funded from the public purse, can proceed with religious observances that do not accommodate the range of religious observances within the community of the school. So exploring what it means to live in a multi-faith community, a multicultural country, a country which is made up of different languages, is a learning experience for the school and for the community, and everybody needs to be involved in that. But they need to come to it with the right attitude, and that is an attitude of learning.
Professor Mary Metcalfe, thank you very much for your time.